Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, herzlich willkommen zur D-Arts-Veranstaltung zum Thema D-Transformation hier im wunderschönen Belvedere. Ich wünsche Ihnen Good Spirit und viele schöne Ideen, spannende Stunden und ich freue mich, wie wir gemeinsam weiter das Thema Diversität im Kulturbereich betreiben können. Alles Liebe!
Hello and a really warm welcome to tonight's event on de-transformation, diversity in decision-making positions in the cultural sector. De-transformation is an event organized by D-Arts in cooperation with Belvedere, and my name is Jamila Granitz. I'll be happily navigating through the evening and the night with you. So before we start, I'd very much like to welcome the three wonderful people behind the curation of this event. So please welcome with me on stage Esther Bjorner-Ocho, Susanne Ernst, and Elisabeth Bernreuther.
Hallo, hallo. Sehr schön. Why de-transformation? Let me answer that with a quote from an exceptional being who went through a big transformation herself just recently. The function of art is to do more than tell it like it is. It is to imagine what is possible. Bell Hooks. We are here today to imagine what could be. De-transformation is about our own courage to envision the unimaginable, the impossible. As the word says it itself, I am possible. We are possible. Our presence, attention, and awareness is the present and key to unlock the hidden gift we call diversity. Our willingness to let change happen through us will bring the transformation we desperately long for. An organization can only thrive if their decision makers start to see the whole as valuable, begin to diversify their decisions, and distribute their power wisely. It is time to let our statements become movements.
We are all a part of the arts. Excuse me. Which was initiated by Ivana Pilic, by Sherry Ari Avraham and Susanna Anna Ernst, and meanwhile became a broad alliance between individuals, institutions, and many initiatives who together want to push forward diversity and discrimination critique in the cultural field and sector. Since the beginning of 2021, we started a 2-year process creating a discussion format like this, which already took place in Kulturhaus Brotfabrik, the Kunsthalle, the Soho Studios, the Wiener Musikverein, and of course, the Brunnenpassage. Today's event in the Belvedere is a further step and milestone for the arts in this process, and it's an important contribution to the discussion for transformation from within cultural institutions, and especially on the level of staff and leading decision-making positions. We're looking forward to today's exchange and like to welcome you.
Hello, so from my side, we're very happy to be here with all of you and to with the arts to move forward and with everybody who feels this sense of urgency. I think we're all here because of this sense of urgency, and the discourse series is something that is running now for 2 years, but at the same time in the background there is a process where a network has been forming and is continuing to form. There is a movement starting in critical mass, and the goal is to continue 2023 with also a sustainable structure to continue this process, because it's a long way to go, and it's very important to build these alliances, also the unexpected ones. And yeah, and we're very happy to see, to work together on many different levels with people. And also what I want to say is today we're here, also the reason why we speak English, it's embedded into an international conference. There is a lot of people also from abroad. The discussion is not only local, it's also international, global. It's an issue that affects all of us. And yeah, the conference, what it's embedded is called Spotting, Spaces of Transformation. It will continue also tomorrow in Brunnenpassage. It's a project with 8 different culture centers in Europe that is also thinking about diversity and artistic processes, organized by Trans-Europe Halls. And yeah, we're looking very much forward to this discussion. Thank you, Belvedere, that we can be here. And we pass on to Jamila, and then, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, the 3 of you, for shaping and creating, conceptualizing, curating, organizing this wonderful event. As I said, the event is a cooperation between the arts and Belvedere, and therefore I'd very much like to ask Christiane Erhardt, who's head of community outreach here at the Belvedere, for some opening words too. Thanks.
Good evening and welcome. Last time I was here, I hosted an event within our Queering the Belvedere public program, and tonight I'm very happy to be able to be a co-organizer of this event. Alles hat sich verändert, aber nichts hat sich geändert. Everything is different, but nothing has changed. This reads a poster in my office by Vienna-based artist Stefanie Seibold, which she prepared for the International Women's Day. It's the last day of March. It's the last day of Women's Month. So, how can museums address an audience that goes beyond the educated middle class? How do civil society topics play a role in exhibitions and projects? How do we diversify the museum? If we look at the feminist struggle, it took centuries before female artists were finally taken seriously and included and exhibited in museums. I do not think that other groups of society should wait that long. Still, spaces of art and contemporary art museums are very much about inclusion and exclusion. Who is in it and who is out of them? Still, museums are about representational issues, and you have to push for things to change. The necessity to revise cultural history and cultural practice in a queer, feminist and decolonial manner goes hand in hand with institutional changes. Of course, this also includes the personnel policy of the museums. We will hear about this later. But I think we all need to be ready and prepared for these changes. This is the welcome from my side on behalf of the Belvedere Museum. I would like to thank everybody who helped organizing this event, and especially also the co-curators for the many hours we spent discussing and working together. I would like to thank Susanna Ernst Esther Oyo and Elisabeth Bernreutner, also my colleague Claudia Slana, who is a co-curator in the public program, and I would also like to mention and thank the Belvedere Diversity AG. So let's have a very productive and fruitful discussion. I'm very much looking forward, and I think I give over to you, Jamila.
Thank you very much, Christiane, and thank you to Belvedere, also to Stella Rollig for having this happen in this wonderful environment. So, what is today about? The cultural sector does still not represent society. Resources are still not fairly distributed, and diversity is oftentimes no more than a buzzword or an analogy for tokenism. Yet many things are in motion, and transformation is definitely urgently needed. So who does and can facilitate that very transformation? How can that transformation look like? And it is a field and a topic that needs a multitude of perspectives and a multitude of voices. The arts is shaping a framework and a process that allows that multitude of voices, of perspectives to come together and to create a space, to question a space, and facilitate a space. So these perspectives are brought together, and we're more than glad to welcome all of you to share your perspectives, your questions, and to shape that process with us. So culture workers, heads of renowned institutions, cultural politicians, it's really good that we're all here together. So, but before we'll be delving into this conversation and into all the fine lines and in-betweens of that, but before we do so, I'd very much like to introduce Hassan Mohamed Ali. He's a UK playwright, journalist, and a specialist in diversity and art, and he's a writer of arts in the Council of England's Creative Case for Diversity in the Arts, and he'll be holding today's keynote. He's already been hosting a table in our World Cafe in the afternoon session that we had at Belvedere 21, which was a really beautiful and fruitful discussion. And so please give a warm welcome to Hassan, who's going to talk on why diversity is an essential element in the arts that cannot be ignored. Hassan, please come up on stage. Want my notes too?
Oh, dear. Just to test me, I think. Well, thank you very much, Jamila, for introduction. And thank you to the organisers of this event, particularly D Arts and the Belvedere Museum. And for me, a special thanks to Elizabeth, Susanna, and Esther, who, for me, have demonstrated what the leadership in the arts should look like. Okay. So let's get down to it. Diversity exists. We don't have to invent it. Inequality is the issue. Diversity, in its widest sense, is integral and a central part of the artistic process. It is an important element in a dynamic that drives art forward, that innovates it, and brings it into a profound and transformative dialogue with contemporary society. To talk about diversity is merely to express the world around us. Diversity just is. We can observe it as an essential feature of nature, of evolution, adaptation, development, and change. A lack of, or emptying out of diversity, a destruction of diversity, for example, the narrowing of the Earth's biodiversity due to destruction of the environment by the human species, is recognised as threatening the future of the planet and all life upon us. So diversity just is. In the history of the development of human society, diversity as a kinetic force, the entrance from the outside of a new idea, a new understanding, a new way of seeing the world, what we might call insight, vision, innovation, is a force that enables society to make a civilizational leap forward. Societies that cut themselves off from diversity historically ultimately turn in on themselves, stagnate, collapse and die. History tells us that. Now, counter to the sometimes hand-wringing of policymakers in the arts and in culture and in government departments even, diversity is not a problem. The actual problem that we face is that we have alienated ourselves from and have imposed man-made inequalities on our diverse society and thereby on our diverse arts community and on the future development of artistic practice. But I also believe that diversity can only have an active meaning for us when it's linked to, if you like, movements for social change, struggle within society, specifically, in this case, the fight against inequality and the fight for equality. The problem that we in the arts community face, in the West particularly, is that we have distorted the history of creativity in the arts, our practice and our critical debate, and have decided that some are far more equal than others and have more value. We have constructed canons of important work and subjective value judgments bound up in notions of taste, of quality and excellence, those kind of phrases. They pretend that they are neutral and objective and unchallengeable in a manner of a religious edicts, but they are man-made. Now, the fight against entrenched inequalities and the pursuit for equality for all is always going to be a political question. I don't think you can duck it. It's a political question. In whatever arena, this kind of work is intensely politicized because it throws up sharp questions about the nature of our society and our claim to be truly democratic. At heart, it is about power, who has access to it, and the privilege that they draw from it. But I've also learned that each different arena of struggle against exploitation and oppression has its own particular starting points, arguments, and goals. And this is true for the fight for equality in the arts particularly. I've learned that the arts and cultural landscapes, the structures and institutions that shape it, how power and privilege are expressed, traditions and modes of thinking, the ideas and worldviews that dominate it, demand particular responses, strategies and tactics from those who seek to fundamentally change it. Now, diversity and equality issues may have been historically marginalized in the ongoing debates about art, how it's made, how it innovates and brings itself into a close and active relationship to the society from which it springs. But I contest that although it may have been marginalized, it is not a marginal question. Indeed, in many ways, it's a central question. And it's a central question, I believe, in the creative act itself. I'll explain what I mean by that. I want to talk about the creative case for diversity and equality in the arts. The creative case for diversity and equality in the arts that I and others developed for public funding body Arts Coucil England over a decade ago seeks to loosen the grip of these powerful gatekeepers and tastemakers. And it slightly differs, I think, from previous approaches. It's not principally about morality, in other words, it's the right thing to do, about economics, it's profitable, or about legality, it's against the law to discriminate, which may or may not be true. All of these arguments are not without merit. I'm not saying that they should be swept off the table. However, the creative case is fundamentally a conversation about art. Now, I'm an artist. There's lots of artists in the room. We talk art all day and all night. So when we talk about diversity and equality, we should talk about it also in the context of art and arts practice. Essentially, it's very essential that we do. So the creative case is fundamentally a conversation about art, but with the true value of diversity placed at its center. It's based upon the simple observation that diversity, in its broadest sense, is an essential element in the artistic process. It is the principal dynamic that drives art forward, that innovates it, and brings it into a more profound and transformative dialogue with contemporary society. I sometimes put it this way. If the creative act could be expressed as a simple chemical formula, let's say X plus Y equals Z, Z being the creative act, that moment of the creative act, then X is diversity in its most essential and mercurial form. It is the distinct root force that catalyzes the imagination, driving the emergence of the symbolic, that is artistic expression. It is the new made real. That's why we cannot allow diversity and equality to be perpetually marginalized as a discourse, to be just lip service or a box-ticking exercise or that moment when something pricks your conscience, to just be something bolted on to the artistic world. I contend that if you're a serious artist, a manager of an institution, or a policymaker, or a politician, you should put diversity and art right in the middle of the debate, together, in all the debates around the arts and society in this country and elsewhere. And it's about power. Virtually, this is a UK experience, you can tell me whether it's the same here, virtually no one in the arts in the UK talks about power, except those like me who sometimes point out those who lack it. And it is indeed an exercise of power, of course, to think you can wield it without acknowledging that that is what you are doing. That's the ultimate exercise of power. The reality is, despite the guilty genuflections at the altar of corporate diversity, that the reins of power, and thus authority, largely remain in the same privileged hands as they always have. In a sense, a culture of upper middle class entitlement dominates the arts. Now, the middle classes as a class, I'm not talking about individuals, as a class, as a force in society, as an organisation of society, tend to talk to one another as a way of affirming their sense of importance and value. But the marginalised tend to talk to society as a whole, not just to their group, because they understand the need for change across the board for themselves to be liberated. It's inherent in their position in society to talk to society as a whole, not just to talk to one another. The problem with the grip of the present elite on the arts is that they are speaking to a society, in our case, Europe, that simply no longer exists. Some right-wing politicians may wish we could go back and turn the clock back to the days when people like my father came from the Caribbean to work in manual labour in this country half a century ago. Really, the elite who dominate the arts at the moment are conversing with ghosts from past that no longer exists. Therefore, only releasing diversity through the drive for equality can renew an arts that speaks to us as we are now and help us imagine future possibilities for our species and our planet, as Bell Hooks was alluding to in that quote that Esther talked to us about. I think we have to come to that place where we understand that those without privilege, we need them to tell us something really fundamental about the society in which we live. Who is going to critique our society? Who is going to critique our society in ways that illuminate, that gives us some fundamental truths? Now, really, I think that is an urgent societal question about who are going to be the truth tellers in our societies as we go forward. Therefore, we need to speed up the process by which these people become visible and become heard and are valued. And if we don't, I can guarantee you the arts will drift away further from society and the big questions that face us all. The arts will continue to be a conventional middle-class pursuit a kind of consumable equivalent of a bourgeois dinner table talk. So, we need arts companies and institutions to rapidly decentralize and dismantle the outmoded power structures of artistic decision-making that dominate. The arts, and you know it, are presently structured hierarchically on a vertical axis. You accumulate power and professional standing as you go up it. It's a pursuit of power. We need organizations that are organized on a horizontal plane where all voices are valued. Why, for example, are those in our ticket offices or front of house staff who often have vast practical experience of audiences rarely asked for their opinion or have influence over policy in our institutions? We need arts leaders who relinquish power freely, not those who hoard it selfishly. Arts companies need to exhibit qualities associated with this diversity. In order to encourage genuine diversity, organisations need to become more open in their approaches, in their dialogues and thinking. They need to avoid becoming fixed structurally or in their offers to audiences and make way for other views and voices, and not in a tokenistic way that feels like charitable giving. You need something more deep and fundamental than that. I believe also that artistic autonomy is so important for those truth tellers to be heard. Those artists and their organisations who have become historically marginalised have to receive much more resources and power to produce their own work on their own terms than they have up to now. So for me, it's an issue of power, of politics, and democracy. Democracy, maybe a word we don't talk about enough in the arts. But there is a clear democratic imperative on a number of levels. For example, the arts in the UK is increasingly funded by a national lottery, which many people consider to be really a tax on the poor. So we face a situation where those sections of society who contribute most to the lottery, and therefore to arts funding, are those who are least served by the arts. And this inequality, like all inequalities, is simply intolerable. The same goes for those in receipt of state subsidy raised through taxation. As the American revolutionaries put it, no taxation without representation. No arts without all of us, is my adaptation of that slogan. And it is intolerable that those with power should exclude working class people, or the disabled, or women, or the LGBTQI plus community, or individuals, or black people, or whomever. It's intolerable that these groups should be excluded from the arts, just because members of the middle class are saying, the arts belong to us. They really belong to us. It's our inheritance. Now, I'm a working class guy. I live in social housing. I don't believe in inheritance, but that doesn't mean I don't have lots of aspirations. Why should I, or my brothers or sisters, as it were, be excluded from the arts because there's another group in society that thinks it solely belongs to them, that it's their entitlement, it's their inheritance? I also think, as an aside, that in my lifetime, even in the arts, which is 4 decades, that the arts have become ridiculously over-professionalized. You have to have a degree, or 2, or 3, or be a doctor, or whatever it might be. And this excludes those unable to access a university academic system, or those who choose not to go into it, for whatever reason. Why is a degree, at times, valued more than the quality of the work itself, or the potential of the work itself? Who sets the standard of a professional work of art? A narrow group of academic tastemakers. I believe that's detrimental to the arts. And of course, there's a corresponding linear career structure that I talked about, which is a very middle-class way of organising things, socially, economically, and politically as well. So, the question that's thrown back on us as activists who are trying to change the arts fundamentally is, should we just keep pushing and keeping on? Now, I have a reflection on this. Many of us over the years have correctly called out the arts leadership in the UK and elsewhere from not moving fast enough over issues of inequality. You are failing, we tell them, quite rightly maybe. But there's also another way of looking at it, that those who have the power in the arts have not failed, quite reverse. They're succeeding. They're succeeding in holding off real fundamental change. Now, social academics call this phenomenon diversity resistance. So what is diversity resistance? I looked it up. I'll give you a definition. Diversity resistance are processes that preserve the status quo, such as institutional inertia and lack of support in the form of non-engagement, understaffing, under-budgeting, insufficient training, and so on. Among the more overt is symbolic bias, in which individuals deny that inequality exists and exhibit anger towards those who propose change to remedy it. I'm sure there's some people in the room who may well have experienced that kind of pushback when they've been arguing for more equality in their workplace or in the arts. Diversity resistance. So maybe they're not failing. Maybe we should confront the possibility that they're succeeding in holding back the tide, as it were. And then the question is, what do we do about it? In conclusion, a renaissance is needed in the arts. What can history tell us? Now, I'll tell you what convinced me of this notion of the creative case of diversity and the importance of diversity as an intrinsic value in creativity was the Harlem Renaissance. I don't know if you know much about it. I was in New York about 15 years ago, and I picked up a book in a bookshop called The Harlem Renaissance by an African-American author called Nathan Huggins. And I discovered that the Harlem Renaissance, the intellectual, social, and artistic explosion that took place in Harlem, New York, spanning the early 20th century, had a vitally important and revelatory story to tell us today. It forced me to try and grasp how it was that an oppressed and ignored group, who up to the end of the Civil War in America had been slaves, property of other humans, and then poverty-stricken sharecroppers, policed by violent Jim Crow laws, how was it that this community, the African-American community in Harlem, occupied the vanguard of American art 100 years ago? The authentic expression for all people about what it meant to be an American at the start of the 20th century. Not a black American or a white American, but an authentic expression of what it meant to be an American. How was it, in the words of the intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois, that the black American lay aside the status of a beneficiary for that of a collaborator and participant in American civilization? It was the voice of black Americans that became the authentic voice of the mass of American society struggling to comprehend what it meant to be human in a modern industrial age, which was gripping America at that time. So the African American gave America and the world a musical form that was entirely authentic, new, and unique. It emanated not from Upper Manhattan, not from the salons of the gilded elite, but from the street dwellers of Harlem and the Bronx. Jazz, that originated in New Orleans and then migrated to Harlem, for me, is the syncopated soundtrack of 20th century American capitalism. The energetic sound of the Ford assembly line, Motown later on, skyscrapers going up, the bustling streets, the different languages and the folk expressions and culture. Indeed, they call the first 2 decades of the American 20th century, they call it the Jazz Age, because you had a cultural expression and a society that was intimately intertwined. Intimately intertwined. That's why they called the Harlem Renaissance the Jazz Age in America. It then spread globally and internationally, influencing all forms of music, including classical music. And if you don't believe me, listen to Stravinsky's Rite of Spring and listen to the jazz syncopation that you could hear in the Rite of Spring. He was a massive jazz freak, was Stravinsky. So it actually doubled back on the existing cultural forms and innovated them as well. So we should draw inspiration and make a connection between the Harlem Renaissance and the European Austrian context in which we're all working and in which we seek to fundamentally change. What are the images, the sounds, the performance, the new trends and genres in art and culture that have the ability to draw on the intrinsic kinetic energy and potential that diversity represents? What could it mean for us here and now if we liberated that diversity from the confines which we have put it under? That question would be a good starting point to open up a richer dialogue and far-reaching action, more than we've had up to now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hassan. Feel free to sit down wherever you feel most comfortable. And I would also ask all the other panelists to please join us here on stage. Also, there is a simultaneous translation, so we will have the panel in 2 languages, German and English. If you prefer any of the languages to be translated directly, please go and get headphones downstairs at the registration. You can switch the channel to understand and listen into your preferred language. Thank you, Hassan, for this inspiring, thought-provoking keynote. That is a wonderful base for our discussion. Before we delve into the conversation, I may introduce our wonderful panelists today. It's quite incredible to look into this very large group of people. So I would very much like to start on the other end of the stage by introducing Eva Blimlinger to you. She's Nationalratsabgeordnete, meaning member of the National Council of the Austrian Parliament. In the very middle of the panel, we have Tina Danso, who's here today on a very, very short notice, and we're very grateful for taking the time and sharing your expertise, as Miriam Sirikamera unfortunately had to quarantine and could not join us from Berlin. But Tina's expertise is wonderful, as she's an expert on intersectional equalities, human rights, and human resources. So she's actually working at the very base of what we will be discussing, structural change. For over 20 years, she's been empowering organizations through human resources-driven strategies to realize diversity, equity, and inclusion, gender parity, and change management objectives. In case you wonder why I read out her biography, it's the only one that you cannot find printed in the booklet. As I said, she only joined us on this very short notice. Thank you so much for being here. Besides Eva Blimlinger, we have Jonathan Fine, who's the director of the Weltmuseum Wien. Thank you for being here and taking the time. To his left, Stella Rollig, General Director of the Belvedere. Thank you once again for hosting us in the environment and also for sharing your perspectives and insights. Left to Tina, we have Natalia Hecht, who's an expert on monitoring and cultural evaluation. And she's a community artist, also rooted in the Brunnenpassage, Wien. To her left, we have Veronika Kaup-Hasler, our City Councillor for Culture and Science. Thank you for being here. And as you've already met, Hassan Mahamdallie, UK playwright, journalist, and specialist in diversity and arts. A big applause for this round of wonderful people. So, what is this all about? What does transformation mean? What has come to an end, and what does need space to grow? What questions do we need to ask, and what questions do we not ask? Where can potentials be amplified, and what does it mean for society that some realities are continuously made invisible? What discriminatory structures are we aware of? Those are many open questions. Questions are going to lead us through the evening in very many different forms. You'll also see in the intervention later on. There's still a long way to go, but as said, things are in motion, things are happening. We've heard about the situation in the UK, also as an inspiration maybe in some aspects, and we'll talk about the local situation here in Austria. So for the first round, or for starting, I'd like to start to talk about the practice, the plans, and the current situation in your field of work. And if I may address my first question to Jonathan Fine and Stella Rollig, and it would be, what role does diversity play in your houses, especially considering the level of human resources and staffing? And also, are there diversity mechanisms in place or planned to be implemented? Whoever feels more comfortable to start, please go on.
I can say it starts always as a challenge because one works with limited resources. But limited resources aren't the beginning or the end of the discussion. And I think I'm a fan less of talking about how to effect change than simply doing it. And I think one of the first places to start is with the hiring practices and the hiring policies. It's not enough, I think, often to simply spread a call for applicants out there. I think one has to go out into the world and actively seek people who come from different backgrounds, encourage them in discussions, encourage them to apply, and then be willing to hire them when they apply. And I think that's really the least that one can do. It starts with an active engagement, and it doesn't end with an active engagement. But without bringing oneself into the process and actively seeking to make the change that we envision reality, that change won't happen.
Thank you, Jonathan Fine. Staffing and hiring. Stella Rollig, would you like to elaborate on the practices in Belvedere and your approach to diversity?
Yes, thank you. I would say we have to acknowledge that there's already really a lot been happening, not only at Belvedere, but in the entire art scene, the art institutions, the art scene in Vienna, in Austria. And at Belvedere, when we look into it, I totally agree with you, Jonathan, that we cannot overestimate the importance of the staff, of staff building and having a diverse staff. And actually at Belvedere we do have a very diverse staff. And I know, since this is also a class question, that everyone assumes at first when I say this, yes, of course, the guards and the cleaning personnel, of course, that's a diverse staff. But it's not true. It's the same. We have a very diverse curatorial department, communication department, art education department. But what I notice is that sometimes this diversity, which we do have, is not really represented in its full possibility to the outside, to what we actually do and what we show. So what we have been doing is we have been implementing a diversity group, a meeting group, working group, and here my big thank goes to Christiane, who has been the co-organizer of this conference with you. And this is a working group consisting of members of very different departments and meeting on a regular basis. And yeah, looking for things which could be improved, you're developing new programs, etc. And to be not too long, I would like to formulate my credo, which is I would like to create a climate where everybody in our staff is not only invited but encouraged to point to the blind spots that we all have. And I'm really the first to be grateful to be made aware of blind spots, of a lack of diversity, and I hope that we all will learn from each other to develop together.
Thank you very much, Stella Rollig, for also pointing out, giving working groups and initiatives a space to facilitate change and transformation. As we have heard in your keynote, Hassan, the politics is a crucial level and aspect. So my next question would go to the two of you, Veronika Karp-Hassler and Eva Blimlinger. And I'd very much like to hear, how does the city of Vienna, and on the other hand, the Federal Ministry for Arts and Culture, support diversity-oriented nominations of houses of cultural institutions? And is there a mechanism in place that funds and actively supports diversity and diversification in programming also? I know there's many projects and things in bus and in motion, but maybe you want to point out a few of them. Okay, Eva Blimlinger, please.
Okay. You are hiring, I'm not hiring.
Okay. So, yeah, big questions, and what I just can say is a lot of transformation is going on very different levels. Starting, and maybe for our guests, it is important to know that Vienna has a long tradition, since the Red Vienna, to have this claim of Kultur für alle, culture for everyone. So there is this notion implemented in the city, and in a big difference to the UK, we have a very strong public funding system, which is completely different to, as I know very well, many of my friends are working in Britain or the States, so it's a complete different situation. I just jumping into that field only 4 years ago, so I just can say what is happening. The gatekeepers are really crucial. So we, for instance, since I'm there, we have for the Biennale, Eva St. George, we have a group, a collective, WHW, WHW, from Croatia, a group of actually 4, but here 3 women curators who are a collective running one of the most important spaces for contemporary art. And we have Christoph Slackmulder for the Vienna Festival. So gatekeepers are enormous important. But on the same time, we have to think, you mentioned it very well, it was the thinking of accessibility and also autonomy of art. It means also giving spaces and talking about payment, fair pay, which is a nearly unreachable goal, but we, in talking to diverse scenes, we try to implement a talk, tell us where are you now with your working conditions, and every field of the art is so different. So this is also a way of making more people having an access, which is, we know that from the sociologist point of view, we know that there is now a drift in the origin from artists. So from which class are they coming from? And it goes worse and worse the farther you go out from Europe. So I know so many Lebanese artists, for instance, as I've been traveling a lot to Lebanon, but most of them come from very rich or a bourgeois background. Here we have also this notion that you have to have parents or a partner, whatever, to support you, that you can invest your time in making arts. So, and this is a problem. And I think the artist scene should reflect our society in the total. And so in a way, we could say, okay, Vienna is outstanding in its supports, but it's never satisfying and never enough. That's for sure. It's an ongoing process where we try to also, in terms of who has spaces, can we give spaces to artists for their processes? And that's why if we implemented this kind of Arbeitsstipendien, so it's scholarships for artists. Now, every year, 84 artists get a yearly payment. for 1 year, so they can just work, and without that we ask them for any result. And they come from all fields, and you can apply every 5 years. So there are many things where enter points, and you have to, it's like a big organ where you have to work simultaneously on so many things. And we, for instance, this great initiative of the Brunnenpassage, which was one, only the first spot of really living neighborhood and diversity. So it's really a role model for me. But we now have more of this kind of projects in diverse places of the city, not only in the center, where all these fancy houses are standing and all these super museums, but also on the outskirts. So many issues, but I say it with a proud, but I say it knowing that a lot has to be done. A lot has to be done for the future, and we can only go step by step, and also in encouraging people like you doing this kind of panels.
Thank you very much. You pointed out evaluation, process-oriented funding by scholarships, decentralization and funding of decentralized art centers, among many other things that are necessary happening. Also fair pay when it comes to accessibility and actually the affordability to only be able to produce and do art. What is happening on the national level? Please share your insights.
Thank you for the invitation. From my point of view, I have to say the main question is that Austria has a very conservative system of education. And the question of diversity isn't a question in Austria, because you have, when you look at the situation that you have people who their mother tongue isn't German are separated in the school to learn German, and if they know more German at a level B2 or whatever, or B1, then they are accepted in the regular class. So you see that the diversity in Austria is not integrated in the whole education system. And that's what Veronica said. It's at this point, it's a question of class, and diversity is accepted with a not mother tongue in the lycée français, but not in the school at the 10th district in Favoriten. So you have all this situation, and that's at the end. You can see it at the universities, especially at the art universities. In Austria, there are 6 art universities. And then these universities, the social situation, or the people from, I would say, middle class, are not really represented. So there are more diversity in the art schools, for instance, music, than people from middle class, or I would say upper middle class and upper, but not under. But the diversity, because it's a highly international situation in the art schools, but not a social stratification. Yeah? So on my point of view, you have always to think both to implement it. And that's the question, or the point, what Stella said. I think you need a very strong diversity management, or however. It's always, we know all the discussion about diversity management as a sort of point to optimize capitalism, yeah? That's always a question but there's not a good other term in English for me. So diversity management, on my point of view in the arts, has always to include the class aspect, to come in the situation to implement it in organization, however. Yeah? So I was director of the Academy of Fine Arts for 8 years, and we tried a lot of things to combine the diversity and the class question. My colleague Andrea Breitschi is here in the second row. We tried to develop programs, but as to say, it's easy to discuss it, but it's very difficult to implement it.
Thank you very much for pointing out that diversity has to be thought of intersectional, that diversity is never a single struggle, and that the segregative schooling and educational system in Austria starts with the segregation in a very, very early age and has sustainable and severe also outcomes and aftermaths when thinking. So I would like to direct my next question to Aikatina Danso, our diversity expert, and ask her what measurements would you suggest cultural institutions and houses from your experiences in diversity and anti-discrimination work. I know that you've been working with international organizations in corporate contexts, in human rights contexts, but also dealing with human resources a lot. What are the thoughts that you could share with us and the strategies that you want to share with us?
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the panel tonight, and thank you for holding space for this conversation. It's a very important conversation that is great to see happening in Austria. My background is pretty international, but started off in the UK. And whilst a lot has been done, there's still a lot to be done. And as we hear from the contributions on the panel, when we think from a human resources perspective, that's really a place where institutions can put their money and their resources where their mouth is, and model the change and the diversity that they want to see in their audiences, on their stages, by defining through good leadership, and it's great to see such great leadership on the panel today, defining through strong leadership what diversity is, because what is it? From one organization to the next, it can mean everything, which also leaves a lot of scope for it to mean absolutely nothing at all, but very, very shiny talk. And so from a human resources perspective, it's very important to remember intersectionality, as you referred to, that diversity is not only about gender. We made some progress with gender, but diversity is about gender, queerness, it's about disability, accessibility, it's about social income, it's about age and generational. It's an opportunity to link across generations. It's about healing, it's about mental health. And so the diversity that we are talking about, we really need to think of in broad terms and bring many different voices to the table, to these conversations, so that our conversation and the standard that we hold each other to when it comes to diversity is as inclusive as possible. And when we talk about diversity and what it is and the progress that has been made, what is essential also is that our tools for recruitment, for hiring, are accountable. It's all very well and good saying, you know, we have made progress. Of course, we have far to go, but we have seen change. As somebody who regularly sits in quite big and well-funded institutions in many countries, I have not seen the kind of change in audiences, on stage, and behind the scenes in decision-making processes, in budget-making processes, that I would wish to see, considering the percentage of funding that goes to certain institutions. And in our keynote, we heard how diversity is, whether we endorse it or not, whether it's funded or not. Also, culture is, whether we endorse it or not, and whether we fund it or not. But it is a matter of social justice, of quality and of accountability to our taxpayers and to our heritages as countries, to ensure that all are represented and all are funded, because the culture will happen in Favoriten, in the Kaffeehäuser, on the street, whether it's funded or not. But we want to see, over longer term, a sustainable, inclusive and fair sharing of these resources. And there are too many barriers still. For example, we talk about how there's a pipeline problem challenge in recruitment when it comes to looking at who has been to which school or university or art school. If we know that these institutions come with a baggage, a history that is colonialist, that has had barriers and obstacles for hundreds of years to certain profiles of people, then we must remove this as a criteria. As we know, it's very separate from the quality of the art that will be funded and offered. Why do you need to have gone to a specific kind of school or speak a certain kind of language in order to have access to the funding, in order for your ideas to be endorsed, in order to be able to create sustainably and maintain your mental health? And so human resources is really a space where leadership can inspire their staff, the staff they select, but also the staff who are already there, to have pretty uncomfortable but very necessary conversations about how change will happen in thinking internally, so that we see the change we want to see on the stage and funded and in audiences.
Thank you, Eike Tina Danze, once again for pointing out the very, very important aspect of accountability and holding space for accountability. And it has been mentioned already, but I think it's really crucial in the discussion that we're having. Also, once again, the strategy of considering the barriers when talking about staffing and human resources, to facilitating shifts and also to maybe shift priorities when it comes to human resources, knowing that those barriers are in place in academia, in education, in maybe also when it comes to the experience that is so often demanded to young cultural workers that they cannot maybe even gain because of certain barriers in place. Hassan, you've already told us a lot about those things also in your keynote, saying no art without us and no art without all of us. I'd like to hear from you, thinking of a policy and also political level. What strategies can you share or would you propose when delving into the conversation we're having right now?
Well, I worked for 10 years at Arts Coucil England as a senior policymaker. And I think the thing I kind of learned is that there has to be a holding to account. I mean, I think that's part of it. The Arts Council in England for 40 years talked about diversity for 40 years and made absolutely no progress, quite frankly, in terms of the distribution of its funding. And it wasn't until when I was working at the Arts Council, we completely rewrote the contract that arts organisations who got public money had to do. So the contract used to say around diversity and equality, we want you to please do some things around diversity and equality. We'll give you some more money if you say you're going to do it, and we hope that you will. Now that kind of yearning and cajoling or kind of pushing or trying to convince arts organisations, it frankly didn't work. What happened was lots of arts organisations said, we'll take the money, we'll hire a few people once in a while, we'll have a few black or brown faces that we can put on our brochures or on our website, but we're not going to change our artistic programming. And for me, it's a question actually of, if anything, of course we have to have this notion of we have to diversify the workforce. But really the crucial question is, can we please play with the big boys and talk about actually the programming, about how we present the work, the archives that we have? Can we have a curator from West or Central Africa who can tell the true story of European modernism and the fact that it has its roots as a European-African conversation at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century? Do you think we really have a Picasso or a Klee or a Modigliano or a Barbara Hepworth or whoever it was, without them actually going to the Ethnographic Museum in Paris and looking at African masks from Central and West Africa? We wouldn't even have modernism. So can we tell the truth actually about our own history to begin with? So what we said to the organisations were that we're not going to reward you for doing diversity. We are going to penalise if you don't. And we put in the contracts that unless they could actually show that they'd made progress, not just that they had an equal opportunities policy, but they'd actually made progress in all sorts of areas, including who was in charge of programming and what kind of work that they commissioned, then they could be liable to have their funding frozen or cut. And I think we're kind of at that moment of inflection where we either go in one direction or we go in the other. We can't hover. At the moment, I think there's a kind of hovering, not a really grasping of what really needs to be done. So I mean, that's one thing we did in policy, is we really tried to hold people to account in terms of the contracts, because they were in receipt of public money. So I think it's not just a question of diversifying the workforce. Of course, why not? I mean, it just seems obvious to me. But really, the power lies in the question of the programming and the commissioning. And I think one of my favourite books, I'll end on this, is Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa's book, The Leopard. Anyone read it? Yes. It's about the Risorgimento in Italy, where the Garibaldi is a revolutionary. He's sweeping through Italy, and he's going to get down to Sicily. And the feudal king in Sicily says to his nephew, you know what we must do? The revolution is coming. For everything to remain the same, we must pretend that change is happening. And I think there's this kind of thing where people say, yes, we're going to change. We do want change, but only so that everything must remain the same. That seems to me what we're confronted with at the moment. In one reason, that's why we have a crisis in the Western Museum, because we want everything to remain the same and change at the same time. I don't think you can actually hover around that question any longer.
Thank you, Hassan. So it's about accountability, not only within the spaces that we create and within our houses, not only in staffing, but also on a policy level. So accountability that is linked to funding, accountability that has consequences to funding and on the structural level. Yeah, and also the programming, content. What is being programmed? Who's speaking? Who's being shown? Whose archives are we touching upon? And how are they presented? How are they mediated, maybe also? How does art education look like? I would like to move on to you, Natalia Hecht. You did, in advance to this very event, but already in your practice a long time, lead interviews and conversations with people who are oftentimes little represented in cultural institutions on a staff level, but also in being exhibited with their artworks. What are the conclusions and understandings that you've been drawing from your research and from your also evaluation processes?
Muchas gracias, Jamila. It was a very interesting, very rich process to speak with 10 experts that could bring many different aspects about diversity also including Iketina. And what I learned from this process is that there is an amazing amount of knowledge that comes from all of these experts that are already working in a lot of organizations that are really moving so many things, and all the knowledge is there, the expertise, the methods, how to change everything. Like, they have so much information on how to do the change, and they are doing it already. So it is just a matter of deciding to listen to them. And for me, even to listen to each of these persons, it has been so transforming. So it is, I think, like when we sometimes have this idea that it is very difficult to create this change, I think we really need to rethink that, because it is possible. We saw also in the Brunnen Passage, it is possible to have a very diverse team where everybody speaks a different language, where, yes, it may be sometimes, it means that we have to get together and understand how to work together. But this is a very good basis. And I think, like, from research, I also have observed that sometimes evaluation, or very often, there is no evaluation, there is no tracking of progress in terms of if we are changing or not for equity. And also evaluation has been instrumentalized just to sustain privilege. So it is so important even to rethink evaluation, and how is it if we have an evaluator that comes from an underrepresented community, and it's already creating a different power relationship inside the system. And so why do we not have evaluations that are about the system of the institutions? We only have evaluations that evaluate certain isolated projects. So systemic thinking is really so important and so crucial. And I also think that there is in research and evaluation one very important aspect that is about not creating harm when we do evaluation and research. And I believe that if we do not change big cultural institutions, if we do not start seeing diversity in institutions, we are doing harm to our society. We are doing harm to the generations that come and do not feel included, and also because big cultural institutions are creating ideas about what art is, what culture is. So as a society, we really need to start creating spaces where to exercise democracy, where to become all of us included in the conversations that are so urgent for all of the global problems that we have today.
So this is exactly what the accountability is there for the responsibility of not creating harm, for the responsibility of inclusion, of representation, and evaluation and research as a really crucial tool in facilitating change, and the question and around the politics within evaluation and research research processes. I'm sorry, who is researching, who is asking the questions, who is interrogating whom? All those power dynamics are really strong. Talking about power dynamics, we've prepared something to maybe break this line between stage and audience, and once again I'll pass the word to Natalia, who will explain what's going to happen next. Maybe just as a heads up, you all have those program booklets. Now's the time to get them out.
Yes, so you can go to the part of radical questioning in your books. And so as an exercise on how we can dismantle and change power dynamics, I will invite all of our podium to go to the floor. How is it to become at the same level?
It's page 22 in the booklet, share booklets. There's some more booklets here in the front.
Is it okay? Yes.
And what to do?
We come down here. Okay, I will explain. Yes, sure. So in this part that is called radical questioning, there are a lot of questions that have been collected in the frame of the interviews that we have been doing with different experts. And so what we would like to do, I will ask the audience to stand up if it is okay for you. And so what we are going to do is we are going to read some of the questions. All of us are welcome and invited to read the questions. And what we want to do is just to throw these questions in this building to fill it with our questions. You can read the questions that are here. You can change some question if you want. You can say a word, wherever resonates with you. But the idea is it's going to be a very short moment between two gong sounds. Just throw a question in the air with your voice. Okay? We can start. Who holds currently what forms of power? Who works in the cultural sector? What does it really mean to listen? What possible alliances can be created? Why has diversity been lacking in the first place? Have they talked for themselves? Listen. Who holds currently what forms of power and privilege? Which experiences of discrimination? Are we creatively engaging with difference? Are we engaging creatively with difference? Thank you.
Maybe other people should go now. I give my place to someone else. Who wants it? Who wants my place? I give it.
Veronica Kalpasle is offering her place on the panel. Is there anyone from the audience who's willing to take it? Yeah, Golner. Thank you, Veronica. Golner, would you mind quickly introducing yourselves to the ones that don't know you yet?
Yes. Well, nobody took it, so I had to. My name is Golnar Shahiyar. I'm a freelance musician, composer, producer, but also advocate for equity, inclusion, and diversity, and fair pay in Austria and German-speaking countries. Woo!
So let's dive into the second round. The second round is, as everything tonight, about transformation, but maybe more precisely on what is needed. And once more, I'd like to pass the word to you, Stella Rollig and Jonathan Fine, with the question with what now it's about wishes. What support would you wish for from cultural political structures? And further than that, is there any other ways how diversification processes in your institutions could be supported? Maybe on a policy level, on a political level, maybe on an audience exchange level. Yeah, what is the support that you wish for? Stella Rollig, do you mind to start?
There is a dream that we nurture at Belvedere, and we want to start with Belvedere 21, where I think many of you have been this afternoon. And we really wish to transform this venue. We have, as you know, we have 3 venues within Belvedere and Belvedere 21. It has so many possibilities. It has so many qualities. The space, the infrastructure, our resources, and we want to share them. We want to open up. We are thinking that this institution, this place for contemporary art, has to change in terms of changing the program, leaving the rhythm of having like let's say 5 to 6 temporary exhibitions on every level of the building each year, having the shop, having the bar. So we had a very, very intense 4 weeks workshop with a working group, people from Belvedere plus people from outside. Just thinking and dreaming and meeting literally every day and developing a vision for the future Belvedere 21. And in my personal biggest wish would be to find a way now to realize it, to, as you say, bring it down to earth. Das ist wirklich auf die Erde bringen, realize it, really change it, which is a huge challenge. How do you do it? We started with cooperations. I mean, as you know, and as it has been mentioned, and we do have our public program, we do have the community outreach, we do have the neighborhood forum. So we already have a lot of experience in opening and sharing. But it's still very contained. It's still a special program and on specific dates and with a specific, I mean, highly valued curator. But we want to be much more inclusive and much more open.
And what do you need to do so? What do you need to have this project come down to earth, to have it land?
Yeah, that's the best question. What would we need? I think we need collaborators. We need people who understand where we want to go. And it's also about setting up a fruitful dialogue between us, the people. I don't want to say the institution, because the institution, I've heard it so often, and I mean, I come in my practice from institutional critique as a writer 30 years ago. So it's not the institution, it's people. But there are, when you start to work with people who don't have the institutional background, you often meet false expectations, or we would like to collaborate with people. We want to open up and we want to learn, but we need collaborators who also are open to learn what we can do together. So yeah, I think it's all about collaborations and doing something together.
Thank you. Thank you for pointing out alliances, which the art is trying to facilitate and to practice. And I think this is maybe a step within a collaboration, what is happening today. So thank you for your insight. Jonathan Fine, what is happening at the Weltmuseum? What do you need? What do you wish for?
Thank you for the question. It's very heartening to hear that the Belvedere is also going through a process of transformation and change. Over the last 7 or 8 months in the Weltmuseum Wien, we've started to take each aspect of museum practice and devote 2-day workshops to brainstorming about what that could look like, how that could be. We started with exhibition formats, we moved to publications, we're moving to collecting and decollecting, electronic outreach, community. Those are going to be the programs that we're going to be looking at over the next year. And I think if I had to wish something, it would be the ability to have 2 kinds of new openness. The staff will be changing over much in the next 5 years, just simply normal retirements and things like that. It would be one, in a direction that goes very much internationally. I had the real privilege last year to brainstorm with people from the German Foreign Office and the Goethe Institute about something they call the Museums Lab, where they started off with really 25 curators from Africa doing exchanges with museums in Germany. And initially the plan was to do two-way exchanges where curators from Africa would come for 2 to 3 months and work on projects in Germany, and curators from Germany would go to the institutions in Africa. I think that's a good model, but I'd also like to expand on that and say it can't just happen internationally. I mean, it has to be the kind of exchange that happens within Austria itself. And I would really like to see the ability to do those kinds of work and exchanges with curators from communities in Austria, whether it's Favoriten, whether it's the 16th, whether it's the 20th, whether it's Transdanubia, to look as far abroad within Austria as we can, and to pair that up with the international people who could come. So that, in essence, what the museum becomes is less of a place for managed curation and more of a place for spontaneous experimentation. And that would be something that I think would be fantastic.
Thank you very much for sharing that vision. I'd like to ask Eva Blimlinger, when thinking about the cultural political discourse, but also drawing from your experience as the former rector of the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, how do these processes happen? Is there external consultations on diversity taken into account when it comes to the discourse around diversity? I mean, you've already mentioned the strong emphasis on an intersectional aspect and on education, but how does this dialogue look like in working groups, in process management?
Before I come on the panel here, Andrea Breiteny and I talked a little bit, and we said it was easy to be a feminist because it was clear women, men, and then equal opportunity, and that's the way. And that's my history in the whole university business. I started my career as an equal opportunity officer in the Austrian Rectors Conference. And the aim was to get more women in the university. At this point, year it was 1991, there were 2.3% female professors. Today are about 30%. So it was easy. It was not easy. I can tell you, it was not easy, but it was a clear system. And to change the mindset to say, how can you make an equal opportunity situation with the intersectional and with all these fields which was mentioned in the diversity, it's much more complicated. That's what I meant at the end of my first statement, to say, how can you implement a system of diversity? And it's not a question only of management. It's a question of, at the end you have to measure it. You have to say, yes, there are 100 people and there are 10 people of color and there are 10 people of whatever. Yeah, and there are 10 women, and maybe they are black or not, maybe they came from the Balkan, yeah. But you have to have an idea how you can, and this question of evaluation, yeah, but you have really to have a picture what it means at the end. What means diversity to have in all positions and in all the things. And I would point it out at the end, in Austria the women were allowed to vote 1918, so 104 years ago. And it took a long, long time to get people, to get women as member of parliaments. And do not hope that it will take to get all these groups that we mentioned in the under the term of diversity. I hope it will not take another 100 years to get them all to Parliament, and it will go very much quick, not so slow, much quicker. Sorry for my English; it's sometimes like a Dinglish and not the English. But that's the point. But there we need a sort of strategy and plan. That's my. I'm a pragmatic politician, so we need a plan.
Thank you very much. Concerning the implementation of measurements and facilitating processes, Iketina Danso, would you be willing to share maybe experiences also from your practice with international organizations that you could pass on to cultural institutions and people in the field of culture that have shaped and managed and shared their dreams and visions and wishes? Is there some consultancy that you could give us in how to facilitate those processes?
Yeah, so many great points have been made. I would emphasize especially around the intersectionality and the need for measurement, which is particularly challenging in Austria as there are so many strict laws around measuring on the basis of ethnicity, and that this actually undermines many efforts to make visible and to report on progress. But still within the limitations and within the national context, for countries who for historical reasons, do not measure ethnicity or migration indicators. A lot can be done to still have transparency and accountability by measuring. And this is ultimately what works. It's not a very sexy answer, but if you can see it, then you know that it's there. And if you can measure it, then you know if you are moving forwards or if you are moving backwards. You can justify resources. We have the digital software in terms of human resources to measure anonymously, to have anonymous applications on who is coming into an organization. I believe what's also worked in other international organizations that I've worked with, civil society organizations, is to tie performance indicators around individuals in management as directors, progress on equalities, on representation of different backgrounds and voices to salary. You agree and publish and report on what milestones are for the next 2, 4, 10 years. And in one-to-one conversations, as you very rightly said, institutions are not buildings, institutions are processes, processes are people, people are decision makers, it's the team meeting, it's the microaggressions, these are the uncomfortable conversations that need to be built into how we evaluate on a one-to-one level staff who we hire. And you make progress and you deliver on a commitment, pay stays the same or goes up. You don't, then pay drops. It's money where your mouth is time, I think.
Once again, accountability. And maybe that's the plan, doing it and making what you do measurable. Mm-hmm. Just...
yeah.
The plan is doing it. So, Golna, I've seen you nodding and and noting things down. So I would like to know what input you would like to share with the round and with the space and the audience, because you've been working with in the struggle for fair pay, within the struggle for different representation and access, especially in the musical fields for the last few years, actively. but you've also been proactively part of the arts, so please share your perspective.
Thank you. Sure, there are lots of many important information have been already talked about. What I think is something that we have to focus on is the competence of people in power in diversity and the knowledge of diversity. So one problem that we have is that people in power, many of them might think they know what diversity is, but they don't. And that is the main problem, because that creates tokenism, that creates facade, that creates false evaluations, that creates all these things that we don't want to fall into, like traps that we might fall into. So I would like to know how engaged and how invested people in this panel are to educate themselves and to hire a specialized team for the education of their team, and not leave it on their diverse work team. And because I heard, for example, that you care about, for example, in your team that you have a diverse, and they point out the diversity. That's actually not their job to point out the diversity. That's the job of specialists to. Thank you. And that is the question of prioritizing your budget. How much are you willing to invest in educating yourself first, and actually your surrounding? And that's a very important thing because I worked with a lot of people in power, and that's the first thing. I mean, I have to really, we're talking about learning the ABCD of diversity with a lot of these situations. We have also the problem of tokenism, which is the biggest hindrance for real change. Another problem is that the trust. And I already talked about trust in the other panel. How do we implement trust? Because you said lots of them are not ready to learn. But you have to understand, you are inviting people who've been structurally marginalized in a unbelievably powerful spaces that they've never been a part of. So you have to know that they need time. It's not a fair game, so they need time to learn. So how much are you invested to educate them and to actually help them? This is a very important thing. We can't say we don't have people. It hasn't been a fair game since like over hundreds of years. So we need to invest in educating our marginalized, especially because our education system from the very beginning, from kindergarten in Austria, we're talking about Austria, excludes people based on how they look, their language ability and everything. It's not a fair game. So and the next question is, what is the plan? Where is the plan? I've heard, thank you, I've heard all kinds of sorts of like scattered ideas. There hasn't been a structured mindset on how do we approach this. Hasn't been. All these scattered efforts doesn't work. We need a unified approach to this. We haven't actually talked about the media, importance of media and journalism, TV. We didn't touch that, which is something that represents the identity of Austria. What is the identity of Austria? Like everything that is being represented is not definitely diverse. We need to come into a communication with education system. That is like the key. So all these situations, it's the priority of how much are you prioritizing in your budget for educating yourself and your staff, and how much are you willing to work with other organizations in really creating a plan? That's my comment. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I would actually, if I could respond, I strongly disagree that there's a one-size-fits-all answer to the question. And I would also strongly disagree that there's a single plan that can be implemented. I would say that diversity, in some sense, if I can use the United States Supreme Court's famous saying about pornography as something here is you know it when you see it, and you feel it. You walk into a room and you feel whether you're in a diverse, open, engaged atmosphere, group of people. I think when looking, and I come somewhat as an outsider because I've only been in Austria now for 7-8 months, you look at different institutions have different histories, and they have different histories of exclusion. I mean, I would say I think the history of exclusion in an ethnographic museum like the Weltmuseum is a set of exclusions that not only have to do with preferring or prioritizing certain forms of academic expertise and using that to channel and serve as voices for people from other parts of the world. In other words, the assumption of voice away from other people, the removal of voice. And that's perhaps a different challenge than one is facing in a contemporary art museum or a historical art museum. So I think the question has to be, what is the history of exclusion in the institution, and how best to address that, understanding that, and understanding its roots. I think the best approach that I can think of is to first start by listening. Is to first come into a room and think, who am I speaking with, or who am I hearing from? And then to think, what voices am I missing? What perspectives am I not hearing? And why am I not hearing them? And to then set about a series of discussions that are often very uncomfortable, but need to happen with people in the institution and outside the institution to understand that dynamic and then begin to redress it. And I think perhaps it's oversimplistic to say it, but I meant it. The senior staff at my museum will almost completely change out over the next 5 years. And that gives us an opportunity not just to bring new people, new voices, new perspectives, diverse perspectives, and intersectional perspectives in, but also to move people into senior positions where they will determine the future of the institution. So, I mean, I think there is no one-size-fits-all plan. And solutions start by listening and an openness to uncomfortable dialogue.
Thank you very much. Eva Blimlinger.
Can I add? You said we have to know the history of the exclusion in an institution. But this is a complicated thing in Austria and Germany because we have a dominant history of excluding Jews in this institution. Every institution in Austria has this history. So it took 60 years, 50 years, 70 years to research to get people in awareness that people in all these institutions, museum, school, whatever, were excluded, and that a lot of them were murdered. So you have a dominant history of exclusion, and then on the same, or in the same time, after 60, 70 years, you have to have a situation where you say you need an inclusion and a diversity, and these two fields that it is not in all institutions the awareness that this exclusion took place. So that's a sort of mixture of history and situation today. That's a very difficult situation, I guess, to get it all on one, not on one maybe, but all in one picture.
I absolutely agree. The histories of exclusion are not singular. And there's a wonderful scholar in Berlin who hasn't written a piece yet. Her name is Wendy Shaw. Her father is American, Jewish, who fled Europe at the end of his family fled at the end of the 19th century, the pogroms in Eastern Europe, not the Shoah. her mother is Turkish from Istanbul, and she's writing a piece which she calls The Silence of the Jews, where her critique of the German universities is that the discussion about diversity can't yet begin because it is still grappling with the silence that's been created by the Shoah and by preference to move all discussions about diversity in that direction. And I think that's exactly correct.
Yeah, thank you. I would just, to build on the point that you made about what is the plan, I think to emphasize what is important is that there can be a plan, yeah, because the systems of oppression behind what we see in lack of diversity is only a symptom of resulting from systems of oppression in wider society and at the root of these institutions, which is why I don't think that you wanted to say that, you know, one size fits all. That's not what I heard. I understood from what you were saying, the plan is to recognize that these systems of oppression and exclusion are common to all institutions, processes that grew out of colonization or slavery. Even if you didn't directly enslave peoples, you benefited from being in a region that enriched itself through the enslavement of peoples. And until we have those uncomfortable conversations and admit that this is common to the whole system and have one systematic plan, that would be missing, the missing part on which we can then, within each institution, have a customized plan around milestones, strategy, etc. So there is room to have one overarching national plan in the way that funding is also very centralized. You can have a centralized plan from which each institution then adapts and customizes solutions that are measurable and for which they are held accountable and report to the public on. They are not mutually exclusive, both are possible.
Thank you very much. Having a look at the time, I would very much like to open up the conversation to the audience. We are very limited in the time frame that we have. What I'd like to do is I'd like to collect 4 questions for the first round. Please raise your hand. Maybe if you're willing to share your name and ask your questions, I will note it down and then pass it on to the panel. So I can see Veronika Kopp-Hasler raising her hand. I can see Andrea Breit raising their hand. There is a question on the very left there and a question in the very back.
Actually, it's a very concrete question to Golnar, because maybe you can tell us about your experience from the Kultursommer. This was a festival we created, and we gave all the power to a group of people, mixed female and male, so 50% male, 50% female, and 50% so-called Austrians, Viennese from the whole country, and 50% with my migration past. And I think it did something to the program, and I want to know, and also from the generations, it was kind of very mixed. So maybe you can tell what kind of experience this was for you in order to program now the city, because the task was, for those who don't know it, it was entrance free, it was a COVID plan to open up to everyone. It was on plein air, in parks, wherever in the whole city, but it was your curation, in fact.
I'll collect the other questions. Thank you very much for the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Andrea Breit is my name, and I'm the president of ELIA, the European League of the Institutes of the Arts. And I'm saying this not because I'm full of myself, but because what I want to say is connected to it. So thank you extremely for this wonderful panel, raising maybe also too many questions, but the last point that you made, I think, is extremely impossible. It is extremely important, not important. And maybe it's so important that it's in Austria maybe also impossible. So what you said, I think, is in order to get a plan, we need to get a knowledge and we need to acknowledge that the exploitative history of Europe has common roots. And the Holocaust is part of that. The exclusion of women is part of that. And the hundreds of years of slavery is also part of that. Now, what I haven't heard on this panel is that diversity work is messy, to quote Sarah Ahmed. So if you talk about people in power and decision makers, they of course want to have easy solutions and they don't want to make a mess. Nobody wants that. You want to have beautiful institutions that are not messy, because that's also what these people in power are paid to do. But, and this I know from the organization that I'm headed, Elia, we have 250 members, art universities all over Europe, and the board of this organization, 30 people, is entirely white. So obviously there is a problem, and as the first female lesbian president of this organization, I kind of engaged also in this process of diversity work, and we hired Shades of Noir, who is a consultancy agency based in the UK, in order to get educated. Now, this is a process. This is not something that you do for 2 weeks and then you are educated, but you start something and then you kind of change a process and make a process that will be with the organization forever. So I think this is something we also need to say in order to be kind of truthful. It's not that diversity work is something that we start and it will not be messy. No, it will be messy, it will change us, it will be hurtful, and it will take a lot of resources and also gain. And one last point, of course it would be fantastic to implement this kind of law in Austria, that all institutions have to do that, for example, have to do this kind of diversity work and processes. But we also must understand what Eva Blimlinger said at the very beginning: Austria is a very conservative country. And we know, how many percent the FPÖ gets in every election. We know, the major governmental party is the ÖVP, who is also not the biggest fan of diversity work. So I think it's really also important to see that and to kind of be really grassroots about it.
Thank you very much for pointing out the messiness and also the fact that doing those things in all its consequences means change, and the questions that go along with what does it mean to do this in all its consequences. Thank you very much. And also the ongoing fact of oppression as a common root. Thank you. So 2 more questions, please.
Hello, I will represent myself as a student from Global South. I think that would be satisfactory. Thanks a lot for the important conversations. One small question, or sort of like question the space, it would be that I would like to ask, probably this is more for organizers, why this space was chosen. Because I think change can start small, and I think being here in this space is an expensive luxury. So it's just kind of a question or an insight for future events that a change can start small. And I think we could have made ourselves much more uncomfortable with being in a space that's closer to the people, that is closer to the communities that we're talking about, like 10th District Favoriten, where my university is, for instance. So this would be a question, and kind of on a hopeful note, that change can start small, and I think we should start with decolonizing the spaces where the events are taking place. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the remark and the question that I'll point on. I just want to collect the question in the very last row.
In the very last?
Yeah, very last.
The very last, sorry. I did it.
I just want to go back to a quote from Hassan in your keynote, where you said, we need leaders who relinquish power. So this is a question for everyone on the panel who either is currently leading an institution or used to lead an institution. How long do you think it'll take to see some meaningful form of diversity in one of your immediate successors? And do you think you'll be able to influence that decision at all? Because I think we're talking about diverse teams, but to me it's always a question of where, who's at the top of the pyramid. And yeah, I just wondered what your perspective on that would be.
Thank you very much. So I would maybe direct the first question that was appointed to Golna. I see there's more questions in the audience, but I'll do a second round.
I'll be quick.
Yeah, well then I'll take 2 more questions and yeah. Well then I think we'll be answering the questions that we have, and then we'll take it out to the foyer and come to an end. The arts is a process. There's many more events. We know it's an ongoing conversation. It's all about questions and transformation, and we will be commonly working on that. But please, Golna, would you be willing to ask the question that was appointed to you by Veronika Kavasla?
I'll be quick. Actually, I would like to talk in detail to you in a right time. But what I can say, my experience had many different aspects. One was that the way I was invited into that space was actually by chance. It was not an active decision. So that was one problem. The first edition of that Kultursommar did not take in account the diversity of the team and the competence in the beginning. After that, you embraced it. So there are 2 sides in it. So you invited me for the second edition. That was great. I was there as one of, actually the only person in the first edition to really try to address things. So I was, again, one of the people who was educating. I was overwhelmed. I was alone. However, it was very interesting. For the first time in my life, it's a personal experience, I was in a decision-making position, and I saw how everything is happening. And that was very interesting, and I would have loved to continue that, because that was too short. So I don't know, that's what I'm saying. No, really, because it's too short. In order to, that's the kind of plan that we need. This is not enough. These are scattered efforts. Diversity, as you said, is not, I always say diversity is not a charity project. It's a philosophy of life. It's a way of life. It's not a charity project. For that, we need time. We need to sit down, think over the years. So that was too short. Now, the person that came after me, I again saw in the categories, very strange categorization of the music. So I don't know how, whatever effort that I put in that really got integrated in the way of curating. So that's what I'm saying. We need like a concrete plan. We need to have like a vision. And for that, we need to do that collectively. We need time for that. We need money for that. And we need a space for that. Please, I'm begging you to invest in that. Please, let's continue this. This is very necessary, and that's what I'm saying. And every single institution has so much potential. Oh my God, you have so much potential. Please use it. Please, we are here, we want to do this. We really want to do this. Let's do it together. And as you said, it's not overnight. Let's do it over the years. Let's grow together. Let's do that together.
Dear Gunnar, dear audience, I'm very sorry for this decision, but I'm going to cut the panel at this point. I think the fact that things need years and year-long and lifetime commitments is maybe also the answer to how fast and how quickly institutional change can be depicted. Concerning the question why this event is happening here, I'll take the freedom to answer that. For the arts is working in a multitude of different levels. It is happening on the margins, it is happening in the center, it is happening decentralized, it is happening in very intimate, not intimidating, but very much the opposite, intimate spaces with people, with community artists. But in this case, it was important to also emphasize and amplify the importance of alliances. Alliances with the Belvedere, alliances with the institutions, because this is only possible when we all get into a conversation together. And don't worry, there is spaces and there is places where those conversations happen, in maybe even exclusive spaces for cultural workers, maybe even exclusive spaces for certain, oftentimes so-called marginalized groups. So this was a very deliberate decision also to claim certain spaces and to fill spaces with questions and with topics that usually don't find place in that very spaces. So I hope that that answers that. So what we are left with are the opportunities and possibilities of accountability, of responsibility. What we are left with are many, many questions and the work ahead and the things that are happening ahead. So what I may tell you is that the next project of the arts will be the Royans, a performance at Donaukanal in August 2022. If you want to keep posted, it's going to be wonderful. If you want to stay posted on the whole process, on the project office that is being implemented, that we can all now see that it's necessary. It needs a sustainable structure for the conversation around diversity. The arts is offering that. Let's see what happens. Let's shape it. Let's do it together. Check the homepage. There's a newsletter tool that you can register in to stay posted on all the upcoming events and conversations. And thank you so much for staying with us for even longer than you planned to, for the whole evening, for the whole afternoon, some of you, for the whole day, even some others of you. Have a lovely evening. There's drinks and refreshments outside in the foyer, and take the conversation on. Have a good night. And sorry, I forgot to thank everyone who made this event possible, all the technicians, all the workers, all the staff of the museum, and obviously all our panelists. Thank you.